Hey everybody, excited to share with you a little bit more about the research abstract that I shared via poster presentation in the last newsletter. I appreciate those of you who reached out with questions and hope to be able to continue to have a conversation around the information that we gathered. And so what I thought I would do is give you a little bit more information about the study itself and then answer the questions. And so let me just set up what exactly we did, and then for now talk about a little bit more specifically this particular abstract. We gathered a lot of data, and so there's still a lot more coming, but this was sort of our first opportunity was to try to get an abstract and a poster at the Female Athlete Conference in Boston over the summer. And so we were really thrilled to be a part of that conference. It's excellent and very collegial and interdisciplinary. And so that was really neat to be able to share it in that community. So really, very briefly, I hope you had an opportunity to look at the poster. I have reposted it again, this time with the newsletter, so you can take another look. But basically, I partnered with Chris Napier, Dr. Chris Napier, who is a running researcher and a physiotherapist in Vancouver, British Columbia. And so what our plan was to put a pelvic health survey onto the tail end of a running research study. And the goal of that was intended to recruit for a running study and then offer the pelvic health survey versus recruit athletes experiencing pelvic health considerations to fill out surveys. So we hope that would provide us with a really robust sample, and that the sampling in that way would reduce some of the bias around who was actually responding to the surveys. And I think based on, this is a little bit of just me interpreting it based on as the person who has actually dug through all the data and seen the sample. I think we got a really balanced sample, and I think that's part of the reason why. So really quickly, they recruited from the local community for a running study, and they had folks run on a treadmill at 3 speeds for 1 minute bouts. And they wore an insole I'm sorry, I'm pulling up my, excuse me. They wore an insole that had accelerometers in it inside their shoe, and that gave information about they're called IMUs, inertial measurement units, and they gave information about the peak resultant acceleration at initial contact. That was what we were looking at. Of the folks that had been evaluated, 88 females, and these are folks that had self-identified as biological sex of female at birth. 88 had run on the treadmill, and then they were offered pelvic health surveys. There was additional inclusion criteria in order to participate in the pelvic health surveys. In the original running study, you needed to be 12 and up. That you needed to have no musculoskeletal pain or neuromuscular or neurological pain, and you needed to have run for at least 3 months. To be included in the pelvic health surveys, you needed to not be pregnant. You needed to be not have had a delivery in the last 12 months, no vaginal, bladder, or urinary tract infections, no diabetes or neurological disease, and not be on diuretic medication, and you needed to be 18 or up. So and it was voluntary to choose to participate in the pelvic health survey. And 66 made that choice and met the inclusion criteria, and filled out the surveys. And we actually had a really nice response rate, and looked at all sorts of variables. We used validated surveys, the EPIC and the Queensland Pelvic Floor questionnaire, which gave information about pregnancy history, delivery history, instrumented deliveries, weight of your largest vaginal birth, menopause status, all sorts of stuff. And then we also got information in 4 domains: urinary or bladder, bowel, and urinary, bowel, sex, sexual health, sexual dysfunction, and then prolapse. So we got a lot of information, and then we also asked additional information regarding how the symptoms behaved in running and different running conditions, as well as running habits. So we gathered a lot of data, and but this is what I offered to you, and what so far we've been able to have peer reviewed is related to stress urinary incontinence during running. And so that's sort of the background of what we did in the study. And so let's now talk about the results, and then I'll answer the questions. Okay, so let's talk about the results, and then we'll talk about interpreting them, and then in that answer your questions. And so we found that of the 66, 12 reported running-related incontinence. Of those that reported incontinence, 8 of the 12 had had a previous pregnancy. 4 had never had a pregnancy before. And so that's really where we actually found that was the only place we saw a significance, was that a previous pregnancy we saw a relationship with who was experiencing stress urinary incontinence. However, we did not find that mode of delivery was significant. Amongst those that reported no running-related urinary incontinence, of those 54, we had 17 that had pregnancies who weren't experiencing any running-related incontinence. And amongst them, we had 14 were vaginal deliveries and 3 were cesarean. And so, but amongst those folks, they were running and they did not experience any running-related incontinence, but they did have previous pregnancies in their history. So the only significant variable we found related to obstetrics was pregnancy itself, but mode of delivery didn't matter. If you'd had an instrumented delivery, that didn't seem to have any relationship. We also saw that the largest baby delivered vaginally did not have a relationship, and multiple vaginal deliveries also did not have a significant relationship with who was experiencing stress urinary incontinence. So a lot of the obstetrical variables that we tend to think may be something that might predispose someone to experiencing leaking specifically during running, in our study did not show significance. As far as the running related variables, we found that there was no association with peak resultant acceleration at initial contact and those that had stress urinary incontinence while they were running. And then the other thing was that the amount of miles that they ran in the previous week and or their years of experience, their running exposure also did not have a relationship with who experienced stress urinary incontinence. And so and also age didn't matter, and neither did BMI. And so while there's more things that we looked at right now, this is what we've been able to put together and get peer reviewed. So let's talk about interpreting that. Okay, so now let's talk about interpreting all of that. I think if you have followed along with me long enough, or you've taken my courses, that impact, we understand that we think impact is absolutely has a role to play in stress urinary incontinence. We see higher rates of incontinence in athletes who are in impact heavy sports and activities, and the higher the impact forces, the higher the rates of incontinence. So it's sort of like, well, that's really interesting. We only had 18% in our study who experienced or expressed that they had stress urinary incontinence while they were running. And so it's really important for us to think through that. And I want to I still do think impact is important, but I also think this is a multifactorial issue. And I think that is really what we're supporting here. I think the fact that we didn't find what we expected to find is actually really meaningful. And it starts to help us to understand, not only is it not just impact, it's also not just the way that they delivered their babies. It's not just their pelvic floor. It's not just any one of these pieces of the puzzle. It's all of the puzzle. And so we looked at these particular variables, trying to see if we could find any relationships. And for this particular sample, we were not able to find the relationships we were expecting. However, I think that it's impact and, that there's a lot of other things that we need to tack on there. We did try to look at some of those things related to running conditions, and running, like, for example, like when in the run do you experience your leak? And we did get some feedback on that, but not enough. Like once you end up with just 12 people in a study, you no longer have enough power to really get at what you're getting at. We sort of didn't have enough people, especially when you're now talking about eight people that experienced incontinence. We weren't able to really take a good look at some of those added conditions, unfortunately. So we're hoping to repeat this. That is in our plan, and then we might get a little more information that might help us understand what those impact and variables are. But again, this is a first opportunity to take a look at that, and then to start sort of feeds into the questions. One of them was, do you think that, and I've got them here, that the treadmill, like, can we compare treadmill running to overground, which was one of our conclusions or thoughts on what we saw, like, is it because we were running on a treadmill? And I do think that there is pieces of the puzzle that we couldn't understand because of how we collected their information on via the treadmill versus what it really looks like in real time when they're doing it. And the really cool thing is IMUs, these insole embedded, and there's other ways to utilize them while someone's running, but we use the insole version, gives us the ability now to actually look at what people are doing over ground in real time, over time. And that's what's exciting. And that's actually what we're trying to do next. So I do think that we ended up, the questions that they were asked are really sort of separate from what they were experiencing what they were doing while they were running on the treadmill. So it wasn't necessarily comparing apples to apples, I think. And so that's important. Okay, next question. I'm paraphrasing, but why do we think that so few showed up in our sample of folks that experienced incontinence during impact and running? And we had a really broad age range. We had a really broad mileage that folks ran in the week before. We had really broad experience. You can see that in the poster. So we had, like, again, this very, like, I really felt like we had a great sample that sort of looked across a lot of athlete types and ages and experience, and saw sort of, and that's where we ended up with this number, this 12, these 18% of our sample. And so there's a couple ways that we can think about this. One is I hope that we were able to get a really actually a sample that's a little more reflective of what's going on out there. Actually, what is the true numbers of what we see versus maybe folks that have been recruited, like I said, for a pelvic health survey. So that may or may not be true. We also know that there are folks out there, a lot of females will actually have reported, we have studies around this, they leave athleticism, they leave behind fitness because of things like leaking. So is within the general public, are we seeing this sort of play out a little bit more? These are recreational runners. A lot of the studies we have on incontinence in female athletes is actually on really high level athletes. And so we have these, like, really elite athletes, whereas if we're looking at someone who's doing it more recreationally, are we seeing them self-eliminate? Is that why we saw this lower number in our study? That could be. The other possibility, and again, if you've been around me long enough, you know I love Leitner's studies, where she actually showed us that the pelvic floor goes through a kind of a cyclic up and down motion that follows heel strike. They studied that with a probe and one of those like biomechanical dots on the end, so they could actually track what the probe was doing during running. And so we saw this cyclic ability for the pelvic floor to go up and down, or the vaginal vault during running. And so, you know, and one of the things that was suggested in her study, they also had one where it indicated that the EMG of the pelvic floor during running was actually much higher than max voluntary contraction during running. So the suggestion from Leitner's lab was, it's a suggestion, it's a thought process, is, you know, are we actually seeing a training effect through running to what was going on with the pelvic floor? Could it potentially be a training mechanism? And so the other thing you might say in this sample is, we could suggest that they weren't there. They stopped running, or are we actually seeing folks that have been trained by the run, and so they aren't expressing those symptoms? Like I said, we had 17 folks who had pregnancies that did not leak, and so, you know, so it's a really interesting thing to consider. Are we actually seeing that training effect that Leitner spoke about? And so I'm going to pause. Another question that I got was about kinematic variables. Did we look at any kinematic variables? We actually did look at foot strike patterns, and we looked at cadence. The cadence data actually ended up the way that it was, it got aggregated, and so we actually we weren't able to identify that. That was sort of some of the things we'd really hoped for. As far as the foot strike, there was differences based on speed. And so, which makes sense. So as they sped up, they actually changed their foot strike pattern. And so we actually did not find a significance there, again, because the sample of those that had incontinence got small. It was hard to power that and to come to any firm conclusions. So we do hope, again, we're hoping to repeat some of these things, and we're actually hoping to recruit a much larger sample next time and get more information. So again, IMUs are really an opportunity for us to look at this in all new ways. It's very exciting for those of us who've been trying to parse this clinically for a really long time. This was my first chance to start to answer a lot of questions that I've had as a clinician for so long. It's been awesome. I'm so grateful to my team, Dr. Min-Hui, Dr. Jenny LaCross. My graduate research student assistant is Anna Nguyen, and she will soon be a DPT. I'm excited for her. And then Dr. Chris Napier out in British Columbia. And again, we have more to come. This is only the beginning of what we've been able to get out there and submitted. We have a few more submissions that we've made at this point in and around some of those other variables that we looked at, and really excited about some of the information that we've gathered, and working hard to get those out into your hands, so that as you work with these athletes and these folks that want to be fit and athletic, we have more information on how we enter into conversations with them. And so again, our primary finding was that pregnancy had a relationship with those that ended up having stress urinary incontinence, but other obstetrical variables did not have a relationship. The amount of time they spent in either historically in terms of years or in previous mileage the week before did not seem to have a relationship with what they were experiencing. And then also peak acceleration at initial contact did not have a relationship with those that experienced stress urinary incontinence. So it's a great place to start our conversations and to really start to understand this a little bit differently. But I think that the big takeaway here is, we need to be multifactorial in our thought process, multifactorial in our approaches. And so we're starting to really get the chance to look at all of those variables. And that's what we've needed to do for a long time. So I'm excited to be a part of that. So please send me more questions if you have them. And I look forward to future opportunities to share with you a little bit more specifically about what we found. I'm working hard behind the scenes to get that out there. Okay, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.